Story 1. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a cold, rainy night in the outskirts of Los Angeles. Mark, a young man in his early 20s, was driving home after a late shift at work. The winding road was deserted, and the rain poured down in sheets, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As he navigated a sharp turn, he spotted a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering. It was a young woman in a white dress, her long dark hair plastered to her face. Feeling a pang of sympathy, Mark pulled over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" he called out. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear and gratitude. She climbed into the passenger seat, and Mark offered her his jacket. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm trying to get home." Mark asked for her address and started driving in the direction she indicated. The woman was silent, staring out the window as if lost in thought. After a few minutes, she turned to him and said, "Please be careful on this road. Many people have died here." Mark glanced at her, puzzled. "I drive this road every day. It's not that bad." She shook her head, her expression grave. "There's a dangerous curve up ahead. People often lose control and crash." Just as she spoke, Mark saw the curve she mentioned. He slowed down, navigating it carefully. When he looked back at the passenger seat, the woman was gone. The jacket he'd given her was neatly folded on the seat. Mark's heart raced as he pulled over and got out of the car, searching the area with his flashlight. There was no sign of the woman. He drove to the nearest house and knocked on the door, hoping to find someone who knew her. An elderly man answered, and Mark explained what had happened. The man's face turned pale. "You must have seen the ghost of Emily," he said. "She died in a car accident on that curve 10 years ago. She was trying to warn you." Mark's blood ran cold. He drove home in silence, the woman's warning echoing in his mind. From that day on, he never drove that road at night again. Story 2. The Haunted Doll. In a small apartment in New York City, Jane, an avid collector of vintage items, found a beautiful antique doll at a flea market. The doll had porcelain skin, curly blonde hair, and piercing blue eyes. It was dressed in a delicate, old-fashioned gown. Jane was thrilled with her find and placed the doll on a shelf in her living room. That night, Jane was woken by strange noises coming from the living room. She brushed it off as the building settling and went back to sleep. But the next morning, she found the doll in a different position. It was sitting on the edge of the shelf, its head turned as if it had been watching her sleep. Unease crept over Jane, but she dismissed it as her imagination. Over the next few days, more strange things happened. Objects moved on their own, and she heard whispers in the middle of the night. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jane did some research and discovered that the doll had once belonged to a little girl named Clara, who had died tragically in the 1920s. It was said that Clara's spirit haunted the doll, seeking revenge on anyone who disturbed her rest. One night, Jane decided to set up a camera to capture any strange occurrences. She left the doll on the shelf and went to bed. In the footage, she saw the doll slowly turn its head, its eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. Then, it lifted its arm and pointed directly at the camera. Terrified, Jane contacted a paranormal expert who advised her to get rid of the doll. She took it to a local church, where a priest performed a ritual to cleanse it. The doll was then buried in consecrated ground. After that, the disturbances stopped. Jane no longer felt the oppressive presence in her apartment, and she was finally able to sleep peacefully. The haunted doll was gone, but Jane would never forget the chilling experience. Story 3. The Shadow in the Mirror. In an old Victorian house in London, a young couple, Sarah and Tom, had just moved in. The house was charming, with creaky wooden floors and a large, ornate mirror in the hallway. The mirror was a beautiful antique, but there was something unsettling about it. One evening, as Sarah was getting ready for bed, she glanced at the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. She dismissed it as a trick of the light and went to bed. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Tom both began to see the shadowy figure in the mirror. It would appear briefly and then vanish, leaving them feeling uneasy. One night, Tom decided to investigate. He stayed up late, watching the mirror intently. At around midnight, the figure appeared again. This time, it was clearer, a tall, dark figure with no discernible features. Tom approached the mirror, his heart pounding. As he got closer, the figure seemed to reach out, its hand pressing against the glass from the inside. Tom stumbled back, calling for Sarah. They decided to cover the mirror with a sheet and contact a paranormal investigator. The investigator, a woman named Margaret, arrived the next day. She examined the mirror and explained that it was a portal to another realm. The shadowy figure was a trapped spirit trying to escape. Margaret performed a ritual to close the portal and free the spirit. As she chanted, the mirror began to shake violently. The shadowy figure appeared one last time, its face contorted in agony before disappearing in a flash of light. The mirror shattered, leaving behind only a broken frame. Sarah and Tom thanked Margaret and disposed of the mirror. From that day on, the house felt lighter, free of the oppressive presence that had haunted them. They were finally able to enjoy their new home, but they would always remember the terrifying shadow in the mirror. Bonus: the phantom knock. Late one night in a quiet suburban neighborhood, Lily was reading in bed when she heard a faint knock on her front door. She glanced at the clock, 1:30 a.m. Her heart raced as she listened intently, hoping she had imagined it. But then she heard it again, louder this time. Reluctantly, she got out of bed and crept downstairs. Peeking through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. She opened the door slightly, just enough to see outside. No one was there. As she was about to close the door, a cold breeze swept past her, sending a chill down her spine. She quickly shut and locked the door, deciding it was best to ignore it and go back to bed. She was almost back to sleep when the knocking resumed, this time on her bedroom window. Terrified, Lily pulled the covers over her head and called her neighbor, Mr. Johnson, who lived across the street. He came over immediately, flashlight in hand, and checked around the house. He found no one. "It's probably just some kids playing a prank," he said reassuringly. "I'll keep an eye out." Lily nodded, though she wasn't convinced. Mr. Johnson left, and Lily tried to sleep again. Just as she was drifting off, she heard the knock once more, this time right next to her ear. She bolted upright and turned on the light, but her room was empty. She didn't sleep at all that night, and the knocking never returned. The next morning, she told a friend about the strange experience. Her friend looked pale and said, "The previous owner of your house disappeared mysteriously years ago. They say his ghost still knocks on doors, trying to find a way back inside." From that night on, Lily kept a light on in her room and never ignored a knock at her door again.